I'm Geoffrey Botkin. We're only hours into the Taliban victory over the United States and into Islamic hostage crisis 2.0. And Mr. Biden does not even know there is a hostage crisis, or that his State Department has no way of analyzing what comes next. So let me offer the pertinent foreign policy lesson that they need at this hour, and here it is. A nation's friends and enemies can be trusted, can be always trusted, to do what is consistent with their theology. And that's because every nation has a motivating theology of some kind. The 58 Islamic governments across the globe should be the easiest of all nations to understand because there's a 1,400-year track record of theological consistency in their foreign policy agendas. But without that background knowledge, there's really no way to predict their actions. Here's what Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said when he was beginning the planning of the war in Afghanistan back in 2001 after 9/11. He flatly acknowledged this. He said, "I have no visibility into who the bad guys are." And why? It's because he had no idea what they believed. And he was also ignorant of Islamic history. Here's another quote. "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we trying to do there? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking." And this is from General Douglas Lute, who was the White House's Afghan war czar during the Bush and Obama administrations. And so, what's going on here? The very last president to seriously study the Islamic war machine in detail was this man, John Quincy Adams. And his writings still hold direct and pertinent clues as to what is coming next because he got to the heart of the theology. And he really needed to because every president who had preceded him, every American president, even way back then, had found himself in a decisive war and a destructive war with political Islam. They had to confront it. And so as America's 21st century Afghan war has progressed, our knowledge of terrorism was very meager and it wasn't really getting much better. In 2011, Mr. Obama and Mr. Brennan, the CIA director, were confronted by 57 Islamic governments simultaneously who were directly at war with America but who were pretending not to be. And those governments demanded and insisted that all references to Islam be purged, totally deleted from counterterrorism training materials in the U.S. military and in law enforcement and in the intelligence agencies. And of course, Mr. Obama immediately complied. And he gave orders and all that information was cleaned and stripped of those references. And so this created an official ignorance and an official blindness, which is still with us to this day. And so I ask this question, is it too late to start over and study the theology of the Afghanis? No, it's not. It's never too late to do this. And so for a quick look at how Afghani theology works, let's take a look at this story from the history of Islamic Afghanistan. It dates to the year 1842. Now, please do note the parallels to the situation that's happening in Kabul right now. In the 1830s, here's the history, here's the background. Britain held the colony of India very tightly. It was a British colony. But on the western border of India, Russia was taking an interest in Afghanistan, so Britain quickly invaded the country militarily and occupied Kabul militarily. And by 1842, the British contingent of troops and families and staff and military contractors numbered more than 16,500. And they thought, it was such a strong contingent, they thought they were too powerful and too comfortable in Kabul to ever be bothered by unhappy Afghanis. But here's what was going on. Clever Afghan tribesmen began planning liberation of their nation by uniting the tribes to the very best of their ability. Of course, that's always been difficult. But when they're determined, they can do it. And they did it then, at that time. They were making homemade rifles, homemade ammunition. They were looking for an opportunity to force the British Army, the most experienced on earth at the time, out of their nation. And because they were serious about this, they took war much more seriously than the British did, who were throwing parties every night in Kabul, putting on Shakespeare plays and feasting on salmon and champagne. That's what they were doing. But the Afghanis had been invaded, and they intended to wage a real war and win a real war by displacing or killing every soldier, every military contractor, every family member in Kabul. And this wasn't about optics, this wasn't about politics. It was about freedom from a foreign invasion. Now, the first actions with British troops were small guerrilla skirmishes on the outskirts of Kabul, very similar to what we saw over the last 30, 40 days in Afghanistan. Nothing too dramatic, but the British were oblivious to the true Afghani objective. And the British simply kept moving their sentries closer and closer and closer into headquarters, which is a fortress there. And tensions, of course, were rising, but the British would just dismiss them. And in their cables back to Britain and back to India, they were just saying, well, it's not really a very big problem. We're not going to see much come from this. And this was no time for the British to be replacing a capable commander who actually was there, an experienced commander who was there in Kabul, with a politically correct figurehead whose name was Sir Elphinstone, and who never should have been promoted to general ever in his whole career, but he was. And then he got the political appointment in Kabul. Now, note some of the parallels to what has happened in Kabul, what's happened with the United States leadership, and what's going on right here in this story from history. So now is the time, with this weakling in charge in Kabul, now is the time for the Islamic leader, Akbar Khan, and please do remember his name, Akbar Khan, to announce the grand revolt. And so first, some of his men stormed the private house of a senior political officer of Britain, and they killed him and his entire staff. But the weak Elphinstone, how did he respond? He took no action in response to this murder. And this only then encouraged the jihadis to target other Brits, which they did. And then they launched a really, well, it was not a huge campaign, but it was a significant campaign. A second attack with their homemade Geoffrey rifles. And in this attack, they didn't kill anyone, but they actually wounded 300 British. But then Elphinstone left them on the battlefield. He abandoned them. And they were left in the open to be tortured and then killed by the Afghanis. And so you can imagine the British morale in the fortress was beginning to sink because they could see what Elphinstone was made of. So Elphinstone sent a runner to India and said, we need reinforcements, give us backup. But there was too much snow in the passes and the backup couldn't make it. And so at this point, Elphinstone and the Afghanis, everybody could see there is no hope for the Brits. They're totally surrounded in Kabul by all the tribesmen who had come in from all over the region. And they were armed, and they were ready for war, and they wanted blood. And so Mr. Khan, offered to meet in a Christmas peace conference. But when the senior British officers arrived just to set it up, there were just a few men who arrived to set up this conference. And they arrived in good faith. They were killed, immediately killed. One of them was mutilated. His body was dragged through the streets of Kabul. Elphinstone was now so quickly losing the confidence of his troops, and chaos began to spread through the ranks. And soldiers there simply wanted out of Afghanistan. They could see what was happening. They could see the enemy and what the enemy intended. They could see the weakness of their commander. And so Elphinstone was himself saying that it was time for him to acknowledge his inferior position because Kabul was surrounded by so many armed Afghanis. So Elphinstone received these terms of surrender given to him by Akbar Khan. And he looked them over. And what did he do? He agreed to them. He agreed to surrender. Now, what were those terms? Now, first, it was this one, surrender all gunpowder. And then, secondly, give us all your modern British rifles and most of your cannon. And then he said, of course, in return, I, Akbar Khan, and this is a paraphrase, will grant you safe passage from Kabul, all the way in the west, all the way to the east, to this other British fort in Jalalabad. For all your troops, all your civilians, all your children, women, and the elderly who are with you, all the military contractors, all the way to the British fort in Jalalabad, beginning on January 6th. Now, if you take a look at this map, I want to show you what they were facing here. Here's the map, here's the terrain, these are the mountains. Here's Kabul all the way over in the west. Here's Jalalabad, and it's 90 miles away. So what was Elphinstone thinking? It's over mountains in the winter. January 6th, how many days will it take them? A column of as many men and women and children and the elderly and people who are not soldiers, civilians going with them. How long is that going to take? Even if you had everything that you need in the way of food and firewood and tents and horses and escorts, how can women and children make such a journey? Well, there were many in the fortress in Kabul who simply would not be able to. And Akbar Khan agreed to let the infirm stay in the British fort, and he promised that he would take very good care of them, as all the others, especially the troops, they wanted out of their city, and they wanted out of their country, while they made the journey across the mountains all the way to Jalalabad. Now, the fit civilians who were getting ready to saddle up and head out, 14,000. And the British and Indian soldiers numbered about 4,500. And so, here's how the story goes. At first light, on the 6th of January, Elphinstone's column began to slowly move out of Kabul. Imagine how quickly can a group like 16,000 troops who are not very experienced, there are all these civilians with them, young and old, how quickly could they move? Well, they started moving to the east, and they left the weak in the fort. Now, so the column has moved out of Kabul. They're getting here to the foothills of these mountains. And once the rear guard finally left the fortress walls, what happened? The Afghans quickly moved into the fort and climbed up on the walls, and they began firing at the retreating troops while setting fire to the garrison buildings, killing all those left behind, deliberately killing them, murdering them, all those who were left behind. Now, Elphinstone was way up ahead here in the column, where he was scheduled to meet the escort detachment promised by Akbar Khan with supplies for the trip, all the supplies that would be needed to make the entire trip, with an armed escort. But there was nothing there. Absolutely nothing there. And so a ranking officer came to Elphinstone and he said, "Sir, there's no way we can make this without the promised supplies and the detachment that we were supposed to have. We must quickly turn back to shelter in the fort." But Elphinstone, you need to analyze this leadership here. What he does at this point. Puffing out his chest and saying, there will be no turning back. They would proceed to Jalalabad. And that column of 16,000 soldiers and civilians was now out here in the foothills, completely at the mercy of the tribes which had been surrounding Kabul. Now, by the second day, they camped the first night. On the second day, they started moving into the mountains here, and there was sniping from the surrounding hills, and it was taking its toll on the slow-moving column. And despite being well-armed, the soldiers that were with Elphinstone, they did have their kit. They had their rifles. They had ammo on them, but their progress was really being hindered by the terrified civilians and the chaos among the camp followers. They weren't soldiers, and how did they respond to the Afghanis firing on them? And there were small skirmishes. Frequently, the Afghans were up here in the high ground, laughing, and then rushing down to the column occasionally, stealing what weapons they could, what ammo they could, what cannon they could. And at the end of just 24 hours on the move, the British had very few weapons left. Now, the soldiers had their own personal weapons, their own personal rifles and bayonets, and a little bit of ammo. but they had 84 miles to go at the end of that 24-hour period. 84 miles to go in the snow. Now later that afternoon, who rides up? At Akbar Khan to meet Elphinstone. And he's feigning ignorance about all the treachery that they had encountered. And he was feigning surprise at what had happened. And he told the British that he had been unable to provide the agreed escort because they, the British, were at fault. They had left their fortress earlier than expected. And that he couldn't be responsible for all these wild men who kept shooting at their column. And so then he said this. He said, Sir Elphinstone, you wait here while I negotiate your safe passage through the rest of these passes with the Afghan chiefs who command them, toward Kabul Pass, which is ahead 15 miles. You don't want to be shot out there. So let me go ahead and negotiate your safe passage so no one else shoots at you. And so what did Elphinstone do? He agreed to the deceitful terms, and he waited there in the snow as frostbite began to claim some of the lives. Some were dying, some were freezing to death. And the toes and the fingers of some of his soldiers they were losing them. Elphinstone also agreed, now listen to this, and we've got to learn from this. He also agreed right then to hand over 3 more European hostages to Akbar Khan. Now guess what was happening to military cohesion under such an inept, indecisive, and foolhardy leader? So when the column entered the next day, entered this 4-mile pass, they were shot at from all sides by tribesmen armed with all those captured British, well, they weren't captured, they were the surrendered British muskets that had been given to Akbar Khan. And now it was apparent that Akbar Khan had not been negotiating their safe passage. It was actually a ruse to give the Afghans more time to get into position in these hills right here for ambushes, continual ambushes. Now here's a picture of the pass. I want you to imagine 13,000 people. The path that they took is now a road that goes up through this particular pass. And here we happen to have a photosphere. Let me open this and show you what the terrain looks like. The tops of the mountains are shrouded in fog, so you can't see very much. But let me just spin around and show you a little bit of what this looks like. This is where the ambushers were hidden, in terrain just like this, looking down on the column, which would have been moving down below. Look at the switchback right here. Now there's a paved highway. Now there are trucks and cars that go back and forth. And throughout the third day, the column labored through the pass. And once the main body had moved through, all these Afghans who had been watching from the rocks up high, climbed down from their positions to massacre the stragglers and the wounded. And by the evening of January 9th, the column had only moved 25 miles, and already 3,000 people had died. They had 65 miles to go. Many had been killed by the fighting. Some had frozen to death. But some had taken their own lives because they did not want to fall into the hands of the theological Islamists. And by the 4th day, a few hundred native soldiers deserted and tried to return to Kabul. But that was anticipated, and they were all either killed or enslaved. And so by now, Elphinstone, who had ceased giving orders at this point, he just sat silently on his horse. He was not protecting his people, not protecting the children and the women who were there with him. And that evening, what were the wives going to do? They actually received a delegation from Akbar Khan, who wanted to do a deal with them. And he promised, come into my custody, I will protect you. This weak man here will do nothing for you to protect you and get you through to the fort in Jalalabad. But you come with me, I'll give you warm tents to sleep in, I'll give you food to eat. And so they accepted Akbar Khan's assurances of protection, despite the deep mistrust. So the group was taken into the custody of Akbar's men. And once they were hostages, listen to this. Once they were hostages, all the Indian servants and their wives were murdered. The British wives were kept alive as hostages, to be used as hostages for the purposes that they use hostages in these situations. Now, by the evening of January 11th, moving forward, the sixth day of the death march, the column of 16,000 had been reduced to 200 men. Akbar Khan's envoys then returned again to make further disingenuous agreements. They persuaded Elphinstone and his second in command. There was only 200 left. He said, come sit down with us. Let's make a deal. Let's make a deal. Let's negotiate. And so accompany us. Come into our tent. And so they agreed. And so Akbar Khan brought these two officers into his camp, and he provided them with a warm dinner, a hot dinner. And the reasons for this hospitality soon became clear. They too, these two officers, were to be kept as hostages. And the second officer became furious, and he demanded the right as an officer and a soldier to return to his men, to lead his men, and to die fighting with his men. Because he knew that's exactly what was going to happen. On January 12th, the survivors realized that they had no hope anymore. Their only hope was to hide behind rocks during the day and then to press on in the darkness toward Jalalabad. But creeping forward that night, the troops found their path to be blocked by a booby trap of thorns. And most of the men who attempted to scale this wall of thorns, this barrier, were shot down before they could reach the other side, because there were the Afghanis lying in wait for them. And of course, at this point, all discipline among the remainder of the men who were alive were trapped by the barrier. And discipline ended. And the Afghans closed in to finish them off. The few remaining men who had managed to scale the barrier on horseback began a desperate gallop toward Jalalabad, but many were slaughtered in a melee just after reaching the other side of the barrier. And the final gun battle of this debacle is depicted in this phenomenal painting. Just a few officers and soldiers with working muskets, only 20 working muskets, and only 2 shots per weapon were left. Here they are, making their stand, refusing to surrender. And yes, they were all killed. Now, there was one other group of 15 mounted officers who managed to reach as far as the village of Fatenabad. And they were deceived by an offer of a peaceful breakfast by the villagers, but then betrayed and shot. One was beheaded. And another badly wounded British officer, a Dr. Bryden, who was a surgeon with the group, who was the last surviving officer of the 16,000-member column. He was able to sneak away somehow on his horse, stumble forward. He was very badly wounded, having a good portion of his skull shaved off by a sword. He was spotted by lookouts at the fortress at Jalalabad, just as he was beginning to be attacked again by Afghanis. So rescuers rushed out of the fort. They brought him into the fort and said, okay, who are you? Where's the army? What happened to the army? And he said, I am the army. I am the army. And so what is the lesson here? It's theological. There's a theological lesson here. Afghanis have inherited a legacy of warfare based on a fixed, unchanging theology. The tactics have been sharpened for 1,400 years. False communication, misleading intentions, mendacious negotiation, kidnapping of hostages are all considered ethically acceptable means of winning militarily over non-Muslim enemies. And in addition to the failure of Elphinstone, there are other notorious examples of stupid, unlearned Westerners who refuse to learn how to know their enemies and to deal with them. Tony Blinken and Joe Biden are merely the latest two. And by the way, Mr. Biden and Mr. Blinken, did you know that one of the most honored heroes of Afghan history is the deceiver and hostage taker, Akbar Khan, who is memorialized in Kabul? Here is the diplomatic area of the city. Akbar Khan, named in honor of the great hostage taker. And you see on the left the Embassy of the United Kingdom here, the Embassy of the United States here. Well, it still stands, but it's empty. It's been overrun. It's named after him. This section of the city, the diplomatic center of the city, is named after him. Do you think there might be a lesson for you there? I'm Geoffrey Botkin. If you want more lessons of helpful theology and history, which can give us a framework for understanding what we face as a nation, what Westerners face around the world, please do subscribe, ask for notifications, and watch this one next.